intelligencesquared.com.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to join this debate. And you're quite right, Jenny, it is a really important subject, and a lot of, I think, the tensions that we see in our society today can be understood in terms of sadly, a conflict between the generations. And just to be clear where we're coming from, the conventional wisdom for a very long time was that you had a rough deal in life if you were in a big generation. And all the advantages would come from being in a small generation, traveling through life, business class, not economy class, with more space, less competition. But the interesting thing that's happened is that this big generation, the baby boomers, despite the conventional wisdom, have ended up turning the sheer fact of their size to their advantage rather than their disadvantage. And just to be clear what I mean by the baby boomers, because it's not a fixed fact, but the definition I use in my book is people born between 1945 and 1965. And in that period, the birth rate never fell below 800,000 babies born each year, and since then it's never risen above 800,000 babies born each year. So that's a good definition of a 20-year-old generation. And I believe in fairness between the generations and a contract between the generations that I think holds a society together. And to understand that contract, which the baby boomers are in danger of breaking, just go right back to a primitive society with no government, no taxes, and let's not even measure what happens in money terms. Let's just think in terms of calories. Let's think of the calories that you consume and the calories that you produce. And the anthropologists have studied this. This could be the Brazilian rainforest, it could be the jungles of Borneo. And what we know is that when you're very young, you are a heavy net consumer of calories. You consume more calories than you produce. That's early childhood, and any parent could have recognized that straight away. Then you carry on, because by and large, our species, humans, end up hunting and foraging for quite high-value food, and it takes a long time to master the arts of throwing the spear accurately or knowing which berries are poisonous and which ones aren't. Then you go through quite a long period when you are generating some calories, but still less than the calories you consume. Then you emerge into adulthood when you are a net generator of calories. You are producing more calories than you personally consume. And then comes old age, when your calorie consumption once more is greater than the calories that you personally are capable of generating. And when they study this in tribes of hunter-gatherers in the Brazilian rainforest, the age at which you become a net generator of calories is approximately 18, and the age at which you once more become a net consumer of calories is approximately 60. This, in other words, is what goes on in all societies, and it's the fundamental distribution underlying the modern welfare state as well. And of course, in an equilibrium, in an equal, fair, stable situation, you would expect that when sadly you die, it has all ended up evens. At any one moment, it looks like an exchange between the generations, and probably at this very moment, as we speak, a 45-year-old hunter-gatherer somewhere in the Amazonian rainforest is struggling back to the family campsite with 4 fish that he's caught through the day, thinking there's only one for me, the other 2 are needed for the kids, and there's 1 for my elderly parent. Why on earth do I bother? But the system ultimately ensures that it all nets out. And what looks like at any moment an exchange between one generation and others is equally in reality a mechanism which enables us to smooth our consumption and income out over our lives. Indeed, I would argue, and this goes right back to David Hume, this is actually the fundamental that holds human society together. Now take that model and then imagine, let's sort of whiz forward to a modern advanced society where you've got an education system and a commitment on the amount of resource you'll put behind each child being educated, and a commitment to the pension per each old person, and you've got a commitment to balance the budget. across the economic cycle. And you have a surge in the birth rate. So the first thing that you notice is you have increasing demand for education. And as you've got your balanced budget rule and you've got your commitment to maintain your education spend per pupil, your taxes have to go up. The older generation working, their taxes have to go up so they can finance the extra demands for more education for that big young cohort that's arrived on the scene. Then they move through into adulthood. And suddenly, like a python swallowing a pig, you've got in the middle of the age distribution of your society, you've got a great big cohort. And do you know what happens when you've got a great big cohort of working age? You can cut taxes while still being consistent with your balanced budget rule because you've got fewer old people ahead of you and you've got fewer young people coming along behind. Your growth rate increases because you've got more workers, and everybody congratulates themselves on being an exceptionally enterprising, skilled, and virtuous generation that's able to discharge their obligations in pensions and education and cut taxes and enjoy a surge in economic performance. And then that big generation grows old, and suddenly you have a large number of pensioners with a smaller number of workers behind. And the pensioners say, this large generation of pensioners say, we absolutely stood by the contract at each stage. We received our fair share of education. We then paid the taxes that were necessary to pay for the welfare state then, and now we're old. We want each one of us to be entitled to the pension that we're entitled to. That's the deal. So obviously, taxes have to rise because it looks as if this generation coming along behind, they're just not as productive or as skilled as we were. We have to increase the taxes, but that's because they're not clearly as productive and the economy isn't performing as well as it did when we were younger. So that on that very simple model, with a set of rules that look perfectly equitable, you just have a commitment on the amount of education spending, the amount of pension spending, and you balance the budget in the economic cycle. As you go through life, that big cohort enjoyed the education spend, and they enjoyed low taxes, and they enjoyed the commitment on pensions. And my view is that that is the effect that we are currently living through. Now, and although these estimates are inevitably speculative, Professor John Hills, who is one of our leading experts on the welfare state, he has tried to calculate for the welfare state what, for each successive 5-year birth cohort, what each cohort he reckons will get out from the welfare state compared with what he reckons they will be putting in through taxes and national insurance. And what's his estimate? The biggest single net beneficiaries of the welfare state are the people born 1956 to 61 who are going to get out 118% of what they put in. Whereas for people a lot older and a lot younger, those figures are far lower. So we seem to have, and I fully accept that information here is imperfect, but we seem to have evidence of this in the welfare state. And then, as Jenny correctly said in her introduction, when you shift from the welfare state to a private wealth, private property, the two main forms of wealth, personal wealth in our country, are housing and pensions. And for both of them, there is this extraordinary surge, this concentration of ownership in the generation aged 45 to 65. Now again, estimates are imperfect, and I do try in my book to draw on the best published estimates we've had, and the debate has actually, I think the book has helped prompt further research on it, but very roughly it looks as if the people aged 45 to 65 own more than half of the total wealth in our country. And it isn't the case that it's going to be, that this is just the inevitable pattern that every generation goes through when you are at your richest, when you're middle-aged, because it's clearly going to be very difficult for the younger generation to enjoy anything like the surge in housing wealth that the baby boomers have enjoyed, or to build up the funded pensions that the baby boomers have had. So that's my argument in a nutshell, and set out at greater length in my book, The Pinch. Now, what are the criticisms? Let me just tackle the criticism. There's one criticism which I personally feel that I feel obliged to tackle, and that, and again hinted at, is what do I as the author of The Pinch, think of the policies of the Minister for Universities. And I tell you, this is a very lively discussion. We could end up spending all of this evening on our university reforms, but let me just say that when we had to consider what we should do on universities, given that there was a commitment to reduce the deficit and get a grip on public spending, my belief, and the belief of the coalition as we worked through it, was that expecting graduates, not students, expecting graduates to pay back for the cost of their higher education when they were earning incidentally over £21,000 a year, was a far fairer deal for the younger generation than either reducing student numbers to save money or reducing the amount of spend behind each student when they were at university. What I didn't want to do is to see the growth of universities over the past generation go into reverse and have a significant reduction in the number of people going to university, because I do think going to university is a fantastic opportunity. It's not the only opportunity. Apprenticeships and other opportunities are worthwhile, but it is a great opportunity in life. And nor did I want to see the quality of the student experience decline. And we could have just sliced away at the student grant, teaching grant going to universities, but then there would have been a decline in the quality of the experience. So that's my response to that challenge. There were other points I wanted to make, but perhaps they'll come up in questioning. But I think the evidence for what's happened for the baby boomers is overwhelming. Thank you very much indeed.
David. We're just sending David back because in a slight change to the format that we've enjoyed before, there's now going to be an opportunity for his opponents to grill him for a couple of minutes. So, Frank, you'd like to start. Yeah. Literally a couple of minutes, you've got to be very brief.
I'll do my best. Just one very simple question. I know figures are very inexact, as you said, but if you were to take, for example, the boomer generation, the greedy boomer generation, which generation gives more resources to their children? The parents of the boomers generation, or is it the boomers generation that, in terms of what they give to their children? Because that's an interesting issue. Related to that is a point you also said, is which generation gets more money spent per person on education? Is it the boomer generation, the children that sort of are my age, or is it children that have been growing up the last 20 years?
Well, Frank has written excellent books about paranoid parenting, the enormous investment that parents make in their children. At the moment, grandparents actually do make enormous transfers to their grandchildren. The flows of funds from grandparents to grandchildren is greater than the value of child benefit. But the point that baby boomer parents, try to help their kids is actually part of my argument. My argument is one thing that's gone wrong is that the only way we discharge the intergenerational obligation is within the family. And it is all the other forms of contract between the generation that have weakened. And what has happened is, instead of being in a society where there are lots of connections between the generations, we instead live in a society where, by and large, we exist with our contemporaries, we work with our contemporaries, we share housing with people of the same age. And then we have these very tall, thin families, unusually tall, thin families, which are the only intergenerational link in an otherwise wide, flat, age-segregated society. That's why, exactly as Frank argues in his book, the family has become more significant because other forms of intergenerational exchange have become weaker, which is why social mobility has gone into reverse.
Ed, is there a question you'd like to pose?
No, I have a series of statements, which I suppose I could make in a speech.
I think you could make those in your speech if there's nothing particular you want to.
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Let's get into this.
David? Oh, you're on the same side, but yes, you go ahead with a question.
How do you feel about social mobility as a marker for progress between the generations? Is social mobility the only important thing, or perhaps generational wealth itself?
I think that they're both important. I want to see improvements in social mobility, but I also want to see as believing as I do in a kind of property-owning democracy, I don't want to see a world in which the under 40s have such a low proportion of the total wealth in our country.
David, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny.